Hercule Poirot, and the book that no one touched but changed places. Chapter 1. The Silent Bookshelf. The rain fell in fine strands on the gardens of Villa Lemoine, a majestic residence nestled in the French countryside, just a few hours from Paris. It was the kind of mansion they don't build anymore. White marble on the facade, a porch adorned with Doric columns, and an oppressive silence that seemed sealed in every corner of the main hall. There, amid unlit crystal chandeliers and two still Persian rugs, something happened that no one could logically explain. Miss Delphine Lemoine, a soft-spoken woman with manners as precise as the pendulum of her grandfather clock, was the first to notice. It was the eve of a small family gathering, one of those formal dinners organized more out of obligation than affection, when, passing by the library, as she did every night, she noticed that a book had been moved. Not just anyone, but the Poetics of Spaceby, Gaston Bachelard. A volume bound in burgundy red leather that had occupied the fourth shelf for 20 years, right between Montaigne's essays and an edition of The Flowers of Evil. And now it was leaning to one side, halfway between two volumes of medieval history. Delphine was the kind of woman who knew if a chair had been turned 2 degrees closer to the window. Her life was a collection of meticulous routines. The fact that that book had been moved without her intervention was, to her, as unsettling as finding fingerprints in a locked living room. "Have any of you touched my books?" he asked with a tight smile during dinner. The diners, 6 in total, all with more or less close family ties, looked up from their plates. No one confessed. No one joked. Everyone shrugged or shook their heads. The conversation continued in a strained tone, but the next morning the housekeeper found Etienne Lemoine, Delphine's older cousin, dead in the same living room. His body lay next to the desk, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. There were no signs of a struggle. No screams were heard, not a drop of blood. Nothing to break the sinister harmony of the surroundings. Except for one thing. The sheer book was back in its original place, perfectly aligned, as if it had never been moved. The local police were immediately called. The doctor certified the death as a possible heart attack, but Delphine, pale as the lace on her blouse, couldn't help but point out that Etienne had enjoyed formidable health. "And don't think I didn't see him looking at that book last night," she murmured. 2 days later, a train from Paris arrived at the small Saint-Fleur station. A man with a compact figure, an impeccably waxed moustache, and a cane in hand stepped out of one of its carriages. His eyes, as dark as they were sharp, sparkled with the promise of imminent discoveries. Hercule Poirot, personally invited by Mademoiselle Lemoine, soon arrived at Villa Lemoine. After a quick look around the room and a brief conversation with those present, his words were clear. "Mademoiselle, there is no crime more intriguing than one that begins with something no one sees moving. And yet, it has moved. I promise you we will find the culprit, not in the shadows, but in the minds." And with that, Poirot adjusted his tie, took one last look at the bookshelf, and smiled faintly. The game had begun. Chapter 2. A House Full of Secrets. Poirot was installed in the Blue Room in the East Wing, overlooking the back garden and a fragment of the path leading to the library. After placing his briefcase on the small velvet armchair, He approached the window, carefully observing the layout of the grounds. There was fresh mud near the hedge bordering the terrace, a barely perceptible line of confused footprints, as if someone had tried to clean their own steps. Minutes later, already dressed in his light grey suit, he went down to the living room, where the members of the Lemoyne family were waiting for him. Delphine, pale and erect like a Roman statue, her widowed aunt, Madame Armande, young Lucien, Etienne's nephew, with an absent air, cousin Mathilde, nervous, with a twitch in her left eye, the notary Hubert d'Arsac, who had been invited by chance that same evening, and finally, the gardener Antoine, who was in the kitchen, but whose presence had been requested by Poirot. The room was filled with a tension that was difficult to hide, as if the murder had uncovered something much older and more buried than a simple enmity. "My friends," said Poirot, sitting down in an armchair by the unlit fire, "let's not be hasty. Before we talk about death, let's talk about movement. Who saw the book move?" "No one," Matilda exclaimed. Delphine noticed, but she could have been confused. "A book that moves by itself. Come on." Delphine didn't bother to respond. She just turned her face away, her expression hurt. "I'm not mistaken," he said in a low voice. "It was The Poetics of Space, a book I haven't touched for years. I saw it shifted to the right last night, and this morning it was back in its original place. Don't you find that strange, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot nodded gently. "Books, mademoiselle, don't walk, but human hands do, sometimes with intention, sometimes with guilt." Lucienne leaned forward. "Are you implying that the book was moved to hide something? I'm not hinting at anything yet. I'm just listening." Poirot turned his gaze to the notary. "Monsieur d'Arsac, were you present the night of the dinner?" "Yes, of course. I was invited by Etienne to review some papers," he said, adjusting his glasses uncomfortably. "Though we didn't get around to it. He was in a strange mood, thoughtful. He said little. What was he thinking about, do you think?" "He said—" The notary hesitated. "He said that the truth has a bad habit of returning when you least expect it." I found that phrase disturbing, but I didn't ask any more questions. Poirot watched him for a long moment. Then he stood up with a small sigh. "There's something wrong with this room," he said quietly, as if to himself. "And I don't mean the book, not just the book." He asked to be taken to the library. As he walked down the central corridor, Poirot noticed the immaculate carpets, the symmetrical vases, the perfectly aligned antique portrait frames. A house that exuded order, but concealed disorder in its soul. Now, in front of the bookshelf, Poirot looked at the row of books. He ran his fingers along the spines, stopped at the Bachelard volume, and carefully removed it. The dust on the bottom edge was uneven. The book had undoubtedly been removed. He opened it. Inside, between pages 32 and 33, he found a note. A neatly folded white sheet of paper. No signature, just a single handwritten line. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't about money. Poirot frowned, replaced the note, and closed the book. "Ah, my friends," he murmured, "the shadow begins to speak." Upon returning to the drawing-room, Poirot had already begun to map out a mental map of contradictions. Everyone claimed to be unaware of the book. Everyone denied any tension with Etienne. And yet, There was too much pressure in the air, too many eyes that avoided meeting, too many answers that were too quick. The crime, he thought, wasn't the product of chance or madness. No, this crime had intent, calculation, and a mind that wanted it to appear otherwise. Poirot's little grey cells were certainly awake. Chapter 3. The Contradictions of Silence. The next morning dawned under a leaden sky that seemed to reflect the mood at Villa-le-Moine. A faint smell of damp wood floated through the corridors, and although no one spoke openly, the tension had thickened, like a fog seeping through the cracks of tightly closed doors. Poirot ate breakfast alone in the conservatory, observing the trimmed hedges and the hydrangeas that had still survived the change of season. As he sipped his cup of hot chocolate, with the exact proportion of frothed milk he had instructed the cook, he mentally reviewed the previous evening's words. Not so much what was said, but how it was said. The pauses, the gestures, the strategic silences. After breakfast, Poirot asked to speak to each person present separately. His first conversation was with Lucien Lemoine, who entered with a nervous gait and hands in his pockets. "Monsieur Lucien," Poirot began politely, "how would you describe your relationship with your Uncle Etienne?" Lucien smiled with a mixture of tiredness and resentment. "Formal, cordial, but distant. Etienne was a difficult man, Monsieur Poirot. Dominant. He didn't like questions or affection. And inheritances? He did like that. He loved talking about the lineage, about the Lemoines, as if we were descendants of the Capetians. But he never said clearly who he planned to leave what to. He played with that." Poirot nodded slowly. "Were you playing with expectations?" "With everyone. And we all knew it. Sometimes he hinted that Delphine would inherit everything. Sometimes he dropped names like Matilda, or even the notary. I think he enjoyed watching our reactions. And you? Did you have hope?" Lucien looked down. "I'm under no illusions. Etienne considered me too. Modern, he said. I'm into experimental music, imagine. A disgrace to the blood, he said. Poirot didn't judge him. He dismissed him politely and asked Madame Armande to come in. The widow of Etienne's older brother arrived with a solemn gait, dressed in stark black, even though her husband had been in mourning for more than 2 decades. Her voice was low, almost ghostly. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I hope your presence brings some peace to this house. Etienne was not an easy man, but he did not deserve to die like this. Alone." Was he really alone? The woman raised an eyebrow. "Barely. What are you implying? That maybe someone was with him? That his death wasn't natural? Madam, did you have any disagreements with your brother-in-law?" "Disagreement? No," he replied after a pause. "But we didn't agree, if you'll pardon the pun. Etienne was cruel. Elegant, yes, but cruel. A master of passive punishment. What he didn't say outweighed what he did say. Do you know if you were afraid of anything lately?" "Yes. Betrayal. He's mentioned it several times in recent months. There's someone in this house who won't forgive me for something I didn't even do," he said. And he was laughing. That laugh, it wasn't one of joy. Poirot bowed briefly and asked to speak to the next person. Matilda, the young cousin, arrived with red eyes, nervous, restless. She sat down without being asked and began speaking before Poirot could even open his mouth. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice shaking. "And I didn't touch the book. I don't even like books. The whole library thing gives me the creeps." Poirot let her speak. "But you were the last one to see Etienne alive, weren't you?" "Yes. Well, I think so. Last night after dinner. I wanted to apologize to him for something I said at the table, nothing serious. But by the time I got there, he was already in a bad mood. He waved me away. He told me not to come back unless I brought the truth." "What truth?" Matilda covered her face with her hands. "I don't know. He spoke to me as if I knew something. He was hiding, but I don't know anything, nothing." Poirot didn't press her. He simply made a mental note of a sentence. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't about money. The visit to the gardener was brief. Antoine was a man of few words, and the few he said were direct enough. He hadn't entered the library. He hadn't seen anyone lurking around at night. And he didn't interfere in the Lemoines' affairs. They live with their secrets. I live with my plants. By midday, Poirot had heard 5 versions of the same story. All claimed ignorance, all seemed sincere, and yet something in the structure of their accounts creaked. Poirot returned to the library. He stopped in front of the bookshelf and looked at the book again. A book that no one touched, but that changed places. That's what they said. But he knew a much simpler truth. Someone had touched it, and that someone was still watching him from some corner of the house. Chapter 4. The First Broken Alibi. The afternoon at Villa Lemoine passed with barely concealed anxiety. The house's inhabitants moved silently through the corridors, as if afraid of waking something sleeping. Poirot, on the other hand, seemed particularly active. He walked with measured steps between rooms, observing details that were insignificant. To others, a footprint on the edge of a carpet, a curtain moved slightly to the right, a cup on a parlour mantelpiece that no one recognized as their own. At 5 o'clock sharp, Poirot asked everyone present to come to the main hall. "My friends, I would appreciate a few minutes," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I have noticed a number of inconsistencies in the statements offered this morning. And as you know, inconsistencies are not simple errors. They are symptoms of a truth struggling to escape." No one answered, but faces began to change. Delphine frowned slightly. Lucien crossed his arms. Mathilde toyed with the hem of her sleeve, and Madame Armande looked at Poirot as if she could read his thoughts. "I'll start with you, Mademoiselle Mathilde. You declared that you hadn't touched a single book in the library, didn't you?" "Of course not," she replied, more firmly than expected. "I already told you I don't like books. I don't even know why anyone would move one." Poirot nodded indulgently. "And yet, on the back cover of the book, The Poetics of Space, I found a smudge of lipstick, a very particular shade. Exactly the same one you were wearing on your lips last night at dinner." A thick silence fell over the room. Mathilde was speechless. She swallowed and lowered her gaze. I just took it for a moment," he finally murmured. "I saw it was out of place. It bothered me. I wanted to set it straight." "And why didn't you say it this morning?" "I didn't think it was important," he added, his voice weaker. Poirot nodded again, this time without hiding his disappointment. What one decides not to tell is always important, mademoiselle, especially when someone has died. Lucien intervened. But that doesn't prove anything. Just that Mathilde touched a book. And what does that have to do with Etienne's death? Monsieur Lucien, be patient, said Poirot, raising his hand. We're not yet at the end of the puzzle. But look, one alibi has already been broken. And like fine glass, when one part breaks, the whole thing begins to crumble. Poirot now turned to Delphine. Mademoiselle, you said you noticed the book. Changed before dinner, right? Yes, he replied with a slight tremor in his voice. Around 7:15. And can you say with certainty that no one else entered the library between that time and the time everyone went to sleep? Delphine hesitated for the first time. I can't swear to that. Everyone returned to their rooms at different times. I went up shortly after dinner. I don't keep an eye on everyone's movements, Monsieur Poirot. No, it doesn't, but the main stairs creak, Poirot replied. You told me so yourself, and last night you also confessed to me that you heard footsteps around 11 o'clock. Do you remember? Delphine paled. Yes, but I thought it was the cat. Sometimes he escapes from the attic. The cat, mademoiselle, was locked in the north wing. I saw it myself this morning, and the key hangs on a nail above the door. No one has touched. Lucien let out an incredulous sigh. So what are you implying? Just enough, Poirot said calmly. That someone deliberately lied about its movements, and that the book was moved not once, but twice. Silence again. Their gazes met cautiously. Poirot then approached the desk where Etienne had died. On it lay a sealed box of cigars. Last night, Poirot continued, Monsieur Etienne smoked his last cigar. He always did it after reading, and he only did it when he was alone. But there's something interesting. The ashtray had 2 butts in it, not one. And what does that prove? Madame Armande intervened, impassive. Poirot turned slowly towards her. That he wasn't alone. That someone was with him shortly before he died. That they talked. That they probably argued. And that person, when leaving, didn't close the door properly. Poirot stopped. Everyone was waiting for an accusation, a name, a definitive twist. But he didn't offer it yet. Etienne's death wasn't an accident, he said definitively. Nor was it impulsive. It was the work of a mind that knows the rhythms of this house well, a mind that understood that if anything should move, it would be the book, not the body. He took a step back. But there's still one piece missing. One more. And we'll find it soon. With that comment, Poirot left the room, leaving behind him a constellation of newly illuminated suspicions. He hadn't revealed any names, but he had sown fear. And fear, he thought, always makes the guilty talk. Chapter 5. A visit to the past. The sky was slowly beginning to clear over Villa-le-Moine, as if the weather itself were awaiting a revelation. Poirot, however, paid no attention to the clouds or the increasingly warm breeze that filtered through the open windows. His gaze was fixed on an old photograph that hung, almost forgotten, in the side corridor. It was a black-and-white image. Etienne, young and arrogant, posed alongside 3 other people. Among them, a stern-faced woman whom Poirot immediately recognized, Madame Armande. But it wasn't her who caught his attention. It was the fourth figure, barely visible in the background, poorly framed, with no name written underneath. Poirot carefully removed the frame from the wall and carried it with him to his room. There, with a magnifying glass and a side light, he examined the scene. The fourth figure's body was turned away, as if he didn't want to be in the photograph. His face was only partially visible, but something about his chin, the position of his neck, seemed vaguely familiar. Shortly afterward, Poirot asked the housekeeper, an elderly woman named Germaine, to join him for a private conversation. They met in the empty dining room, where the china cups were still set out for a tea that no one had drunk. "Madame Germaine," Poirot began with a friendly smile, "you have served in this house for how long?" 34 years, monsieur," he replied in a trembling but clear voice. "So you knew Mr. Etienne well from a young age?" "Too well, I'd say. Sometimes knowing too much about someone is more of a burden than a privilege." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "I found this photograph in the hallway. Do you know who the person in the background, almost hidden, is?" Germaine looked down. Her fingers slowly intertwined. "Yes, of course I know. His name was Alphonse. He was Etienne's younger brother, the one who disappeared." Poirot raised his eyebrows. Did he disappear? One night he left. No one ever saw him again. Some said he died in the war, others that he went to America. Etienne never wanted to speak of him. He erased his name from all documents. He even had his portrait removed from the living room. And why? Because Etienne believed Alphonse had betrayed him. There was an argument over money, an old inheritance from his mother. But it was never really known. Only after that, Alphonse vanished, and no one else dared to ask. Poirot remained silent. The puzzle was beginning to take shape. He allowed himself a moment of contemplation before speaking softly. Was there any correspondence with him? Letters? Telegrams? Germaine shook her head. "Not that I know of, but a few days ago I saw something strange." "Yeah." Monsieur Etienne received an envelope with no return address. He opened it silently, then went up to his room without dinner. That same evening, he asked the notary to come to the villa. Poirot leaned forward. "Where is that envelope?" "I don't know, but maybe it's still in his desk. He had a habit of keeping everything in the third drawer, in the ayoche, one he always locked." That same afternoon, Poirot asked to be let back into Etienne's office. With the help of the notary, Darsac, who had a duplicate key to the drawer, they opened it. Inside, among receipts, bank papers, and an old pocket, a watch, they found the envelope, empty. But on the inside, almost imperceptible, a number written in pencil could be seen. Touche 1943. Poirot noted it down delicately. "Do you have any suggestions, Mr. Darsac? An account number, or a safe deposit box number, maybe a code? I couldn't say." Poirot didn't reply. His mind was already working at full speed. As he left the room, he noticed Lucien talking on the phone in the hall. When he saw him, he quickly hung up. "An urgent call, monsieur?" asked Poirot quietly. "A colleague from Paris. Nothing important." "Ah, well, Paris is lovely in spring," said Poirot, "although I wonder if it's also a good place to hide secrets." Lucien didn't reply. He just forced a smile and disappeared upstairs. Poirot turned toward the corridor. At the far end, Matilda was looking at him from the threshold of the library. When their eyes met, she turned immediately. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. An erased brother, a book moved twice, a secret number, and too many witnesses who knew more than they were saying. The death of Etienne Lemoine was not a crime, of opportunity. It was the final chapter of a book that someone had been writing for many years. Chapter 6. The Game of Silent Lies. As night fell, the villa fell into a silence even heavier than before. The doors were closed, the lights dimmed, and the breeze barely stirred the linen curtains on the ground floor. Poirot, faithful to his routine, had a cup of lime tea in the greenhouse before retiring. However, his eyes remained sharp. In his mind, every word, every silence, every averted glance began to draw a precise geometry. At 10 o'clock, he sent a handwritten note, in his neat, meticulous handwriting, asking everyone to come to the library at 11 the following morning for a group discussion. No one declined, but Poirot had plans before that meeting. At 7 in the morning, with the first light of sunlight barely illuminating the eastern windows, Poirot crept stealthily to the housekeeper's servant's room. Germaine was waiting for him, already dressed and awake, as if she had known he would come. "I knew it, Monsieur Poirot," he said with a sigh. "You never rest when you smell lies." "Exactly, madam. And last night I smelled several." Poirot then headed, accompanied by Germaine, to the attic in the north wing. There, among Christmas boxes, forgotten paintings and dusty trunks, they found what he had hoped for, a safe wedged into the wall, hidden behind a screen imitating a Tuscan landscape. "I don't have the combination," Germaine warned. "Perhaps we do," corrected Poirot, taking the note from Etienne's drawer out of his pocket. Down 1943. He turned the dial carefully, in 3 smooth movements, and the door opened with an almost theatrical click. Inside, neatly stacked, were old documents, a sealed envelope, and a folder with a word written in blue ink. Alphonse Poirot took the envelope. It contained a handwritten letter in a handwriting different from Etienne's. It was firm, angular, emotional. "Etienne, I don't want your money. I never wanted it, but this time I won't stay in the shadows. Everyone thinks I'm dead, and you let them. I'm coming back, and when I do, I'm going to make you tell the truth. Signed A." Poirot closed the letter with a grave expression. Then he leafed through the folder. It contained a copy of the will of Etienne and Alphonse's mother, but with 2 different versions. In one, Alphonse was the beneficiary of the country estate in Arles. In the other, Etienne was listed as the sole heir. The dates were altered, duplicate signatures, a fraud. Etienne had hidden one legal document, altered another, and erased his brother not only from the family, but from the estate. For decades, everyone believed Alphonse had vanished voluntarily, but Poirot no longer believed it. He quickly got out and headed to Notary Darsac's office. He found him clumsily sorting through his briefcase. "Monsieur Darsac," said Poirot, closing the door behind him, "do you know how many versions of Madame Lemoine's will there are?" The notary froze. He tried to speak, but only made a dry sound. "What do you mean?" "That Etienne manipulated the document. that you helped legitimize the second will, the one that benefited him exclusively. Darsac swallowed. I just did what I was told. He had the signature, the ink. It looked legitimate. I didn't want to ask questions. It was easier. Ease is often the first betrayal of justice, said Poirot sternly. Darsac collapsed into the armchair. I didn't know. Alphonse was still alive. Etienne told me he died at the front. I never imagined that. What if I told you Alphonse came back? Darsac's eyes widened. He came back? To this house? Poirot didn't answer directly. He stood up. Sometimes the past doesn't come back screaming. It comes back silently, moving a book, leaving a note. And with that, Poirot left. In the corridor, he briefly passed Madame Armande, who stopped to regard him coldly. Have you solved your enigma yet, Monsieur Poirot? Not quite, madame, he replied politely. But I have the shape of the void. And when one knows the contours of the gap, it's only a matter of time before the piece that fills it appears. That morning, when the library clock struck 11, everyone was seated just as Poirot had requested. Lucien seemed uneasy. Mathilde kept her gaze lowered, Delphine as rigid as ever, and Madame Armande with an air of calculated defiance. Poirot entered without haste. My friends, thank you for being here. Today, finally, we will begin to see what has been before our eyes since the beginning, and with that, he turned the page in his notebook where he had jotted down a word, Alphonse. A very long shadow had just slipped into the room, and no one was ready for what that shadow was going to reveal. Chapter 7. A forbidden name, the name echoed, through the library as if spoken by a ghost. Alphonse. For a moment the air seemed to stand still. No one present spoke. Lucien let out a slight cough, as if something had caught in his throat. Madame Armande turned her head slightly. Mathilde dropped a white handkerchief, which she tried to pick up without looking at anyone. And Delphine, with her usual composure, didn't blink, but her knuckles turned white on the armrest of the chair. Poirot, however, didn't dwell on the immediate reaction. His gaze scanned each face carefully, allowing the silence to absorb meaning. No one wishes to comment? He finally asked, his voice calm. Not even you, Madame Armande? The older woman narrowed her eyes. Her face didn't tense. On the contrary, it assumed an expression of cold fatigue, as if she had been waiting for this conversation for years. You said it yourself, Monsieur Poirot. That name was eliminated from this house. And yet, madame, ghosts don't disappear when their name is no longer spoken. They just go into hiding. Poirot walked slowly down the centre of the library, like an actor sizing up a stage. He stopped next to Etienne's desk. Alphonse Lemoine didn't die. He wasn't a victim of war, nor did he flee out of shame. He was exiled by his brother, due to an inheritance dispute, and yet he's back. Come back? Mathilde asked, almost in a whisper. Yes, Poirot affirmed with a slight nod. He returned recently, discreetly. He entered this house, not to cause a scandal, but to demand justice. Etienne received a letter from him a few days before his death. A letter that disturbed him deeply, so much so that he asked the notary to come urgently. Darsac, sitting by the grandfather clock, said nothing. He just looked down. Poirot continued, "And now we better understand the symbol of the crime. It wasn't the body that moved, but the book. A seemingly harmless object, but deeply laden with meaning. Because Etienne often hid things between its pages, not legal documents, not banking secrets, but memories, photographs, letters, traces of a past he was afraid to face." Delphine intervened in a low but controlled voice. "Are you implying that Alphonse killed Etienne?" Poirot shook his head. "No, mademoiselle. I'm saying that your return precipitated a truth that someone else wasn't willing to face." A shadow crossed Lucien's face. Who then? Who could fear his return so much? Poirot turned towards him slowly. "Sometimes we fear not the man, Monsieur Lucien, but what his return reveals. Imagine a structure carefully built on a lie. Alphonse's return was a stone that could bring it all down." Poirot paused, let his words sink in, and then turned his attention to Mathilde. "Mademoiselle, last night you mentioned that Etienne spoke to you in strange terms, that he told you not to come back unless you brought the truth. Do you remember that?" "Yes, I remember," he murmured. "Maybe he wasn't referring to a confession from you. Maybe he was afraid you already knew something he'd kept hidden for decades." Mathilde pressed her lips together. Her face tightened. Finally she murmured, "I saw a man, the day before dinner, in the garden. He was tall, wearing a hat, walking slowly. I didn't quite recognize his face, but he looked like Etienne, like an older version. He scared me." Poirot nodded slowly. "Alphonse. He came back unannounced. He watched. Maybe he tried to talk to Etienne. Maybe he succeeded. But that night, someone else also knew he was back. Someone who couldn't allow it." At that moment Madame Armand rose from her armchair. "Enough," he said, his voice sounding younger than it looked. "This theatre, this speculation, is an insult." Poirot was unfazed. "Madam, do you wish to deny that you were the first to benefit when Alphonse was erased from the records? That your late husband inherited property that, in theory, belonged to your brother-in-law?" "I had no choice," he shouted. "Alphonse was irresponsible. He would have destroyed everything, everything." Poirot lowered his voice as if wrapping it in velvet. "And Etienne, wasn't he also one of those, by lying, by expelling his own brother to keep the family empire intact?" The woman trembled. She didn't speak again. She sank slowly into the armchair, her eyes lost in the carpet. Poirot turned on his heels. "My friends, we now know the following. Etienne was confronted about his past. He panicked. He summoned the notary, possibly to prepare a rectification. But before he could do so, someone stopped him. How did they kill him?" Lucien asked, as if the air in the room had grown thicker. Poirot sighed. "That, sir, still requires confirmation, but I assure you it was subtle, precise, like the movement of a book that no one saw, but we all felt." He turned towards the door. "And now, with your permission, I must visit the old guardhouse. I've been told no one has used it for years." Delphine watched him closely. "Why there?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Because if one returns after decades of absence and wants to observe without being seen, needs a hiding place, and the shadow that is still missing in this story." Perhaps it didn't go as far as everyone thinks. Chapter 8. The Invisible Guardian. The gatehouse was located at the southern end of the property, hidden between a row of twisted cypress trees and a moss-covered stone wall. At first glance, it appeared abandoned. The windows were covered in dust, the roof had loose tiles, and the rusty gate creaked faintly when Poirot pushed against it with his cane. However, to the detective's eye, there were signs of recent activity. The gravel, for example, was disturbed, not by the wind, but by careful footsteps. And at the edge of the door, a strand of blue thread protruded from the lock, caught as if by accident. Poirot opened the door slowly. The interior was cramped and dark, barely furnished, with a wicker chair, an old stove and a dusty table. But it wasn't empty. On the table lay a cup with dried coffee grounds, a copy of Le Figaro from the day before, and a folded handkerchief with embroidered initials. El Poirot took it delicately between his fingers. "So, you are here, my friend, or they were." He searched the drawers. Nothing. But behind the stove, hidden in a gap in the wall, he found a wooden box. Inside, an empty bottle with traces of amber liquid and a discarded syringe. Poirot frowned. The bottle still had a torn label, Digitalis, a cardiotonic, powerful, potentially fatal in high doses. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. It wasn't a natural heart attack then. It was induced, precisely administered by someone who knew exactly how much would be needed. He left the shed with the box under his arm. Halfway back to the house, he stopped when he saw a figure by the hedge. Lucien. "Are you spying on me, monsieur?" asked Poirot, without turning around. "No. I was walking. I don't have to explain myself for walking in my yard, do I?" "But it's not your garden yet," Poirot replied gently, turning to look at him. "And walking is one thing. Following someone is another." Lucien looked down, then raised his head with sudden aggression. "What are you after with all this, Poirot? Glory? To unearth misery? Everyone in this house has secrets." "That's precisely why I'm here, sir, because among so many secrets, there's one that killed a man." Lucien turned around without answering and disappeared into the trees. Back at the house, Poirot asked to see Delphine privately. He found her in the music room, sitting in front of a closed piano, her fingers interlaced in her lap. "Did you know someone had returned, mademoiselle? Did you know before the others?" Delphine did not respond immediately. "I sensed it," she finally said. "There are things you feel. A presence, an energy. When I saw the book out of place, I knew it wasn't a coincidence, not something from this house. It was a crack. And did you talk about it with anyone?" "With no one. Why? No one here listens. Everyone is protecting themselves. Madame Armande keeps quiet because it suits her. Lucien lies because he learned it from his mother. Mathilde lives in her own world of fears. Etienne—" She paused. "Etienne stopped listening years ago." Poirot watched her in silence. "And you, mademoiselle, what do you protect?" Delphine smiled slightly, for the first time. "I have nothing to protect. I just want to know the truth." Poirot nodded. "So listen to me. The murder was committed with Digitalis, a poison that acts on the heart. What was presented as a heart attack was actually a meticulous execution." Delphine didn't seem surprised. And who was it? I don't know yet. But I do know this. The killer didn't act out of hatred, nor out of greed. He acted out of fear. Of Alphonse's return, yes, but above all, of the collapse of a story carefully constructed over years. Delphine took a deep breath. And what will you do now? Poirot stood up. Gather everyone together once again, tonight, in the library, and I'll tell you what really happened, or almost everything, and the rest. Poirot turned from the doorway. The rest will be revealed by those who fear to hear it the most. At 8 o'clock sharp, the library was full again. Poirot entered elegant as ever, his walking stick resting against his chest and his steps soft. "My friends," he began, "this story began with a moving book, but books don't move by themselves. Not even secrets are kept silent forever." And with a look that encompassed everyone, he concluded, "Tonight, one of you will decide whether to confess, or whether to let me. Because the time for silence is over." The grandfather clock struck a single chime, and the mystery, like the forgotten book, was about to open on the correct page. Chapter 9. The Silent Confessional. The library was lit only by the wall lamps. The shadows of the portraits hung long over the shelves, as if they were listening intently. Everyone was there. Delphine standing by the window, Lucien sitting in a corner, legs crossed and frowning, Mathilde huddled beside the closed piano, Madame Armande as rigid as a marble figure, and the notary Darsac, pale, holding a crumpled handkerchief. Poirot remained in the centre, unhurried, without unnecessary drama. He observed, he calculated, he waited for the right moment, like a watchmaker, before a mechanism about to reveal itself. "Thank you for coming again," he said, with a courtesy that barely masked the tension. "Tonight there won't be an interrogation, but a presentation. You've been living with loose puzzle pieces for years, and now we'll put them together." No one responded. Poirot walked towards the bookshelf where it had all begun. The book was moved twice, once before Etienne's death, once after. The first time it was manipulated to extract a note, a threat, or perhaps a warning. The second time it was to return something that should have remained hidden. He turned slowly towards Mathilde. "You, mademoiselle, lied about not touching the book. Then you admitted to having touched it just to straighten it. But it was more than that, wasn't it?" Mathilde nodded with moist eyes. "I saw it was out of place. I opened it out of curiosity. I found the note. I was scared. I didn't understand what it meant. And instead of telling anyone, you put it back where it belonged, hoping it would all go away. That's what many people do when faced with crime, mademoiselle, hoping it will just go away." Poirot turned around again. "The poison used was digitalis it, was found in a hidden shed, along with personal belongings marked with Alphonse Lemoine's initials. So yes, Alphonse came back, but he wasn't the one who killed Etienne." Madame Armande looked at him with sudden harshness. "How do you know?" Poirot approached. "Because the vial of digitalis was empty, and the used syringe was carefully discarded. Someone wanted to make it look like the crime never happened. Alphonse, after years of exile, would have had reason to confront his brother, but not to hide his actions, not to plan them so meticulously. Alphonse wanted justice, not silence, Silence. Deep. Tense. Poirot then turned to Lucien. "You were the first to mention the colleague in Paris." "The phone call you abruptly cut off, but that call, it was never made from the home phone, was it?" Lucien frowned. "How do you know?" "Because I checked the dial this afternoon. It hasn't turned in days. You faked a call because something or someone disturbed you. What was it, sir?" Lucien looked away. He pressed his lips together. He didn't respond. "Perhaps he knew Alphonse had returned," Poirot continued. "Perhaps he saw him. Perhaps he thought his presence would jeopardize something important. His possible inheritance, his image, his truth. Did he offer him money to leave?" "No!" Lucien snapped. "I just asked him not to show up, not to talk to Delphine, not to stir things up." Poirot took a step closer. "And he threatened him?" "No. He left. He left that night. He looked at me as if he already knew they were going to silence him." Poirot turned again, this time slowly, until he was facing the only person who had not moved throughout the entire presentation, Madame Armande. "Madame," he said gravely, "you had the oldest motive, fear of the truth. It was you who convinced Etienne to alter the will decades ago. It was you who benefited most from the silence. And when you learned that Alphonse was back, you understood that Etienne could waver, that he could correct the past." "Lee," Armande said, rising like a dark flame. "He would never have confessed. Never. I just wanted to protect the family name." "And that's why you killed him?" Armande hesitated. Her face cracked for the first time. "It wasn't hate. It was need. Etienne wasn't sleeping anymore. He was having nightmares. He was going to confess, to give it all back. I just gave him a dose to calm him down. Just one." Her voice lowered, barely audible. But his heart stopped. It stopped. The silence was absolute. No one was. Breathing. Poirot approached slowly. "Madam, crimes committed out of fear of the truth are the saddest, because they destroy the soul before the law condemns them." She didn't cry. She just sat slowly, like an ancient figure about to collapse. Poirot sighed. Then he turned to the others. "The crime has been explained. The circle has closed, and now what remains will be the task of justice." He went to the window, watching the moon peek through the branches. But there's still one more page to go, the one about the real return. And with that, he took a letter out of his pocket. He signed it, Alphonse Lemoine, and the sender wasn't as far away as everyone thought. Chapter 10. The Shadow That Watched. The letter Poirot held was brief, written in black ink and old-fashioned handwriting, firm, unfaltering. It wasn't a farewell note or a confession. It was an observation, a warning written with the serenity of someone who had waited decades for the right moment to speak. "I'm not looking for revenge, just the truth. I have walked the margins of time and blood. This house has walls that know how to lie. But I know what was stolen, and I know who was the first to silence me." Hercule. Poirot placed the letter on the low table in the library, next to Bachelard's book, thus closing the circle. Everyone looked at it without touching it, as if it were a cursed object. Alphonse left this letter in the booth, just below the safe. Poirot explained. He didn't mail it. He didn't hide it in an envelope. He left it there to be found, not by Etienne, not by the police, by someone who would carefully search for the truth. That person was me. Delphine was the first to speak. "Where is he now?" Poirot turned his head towards her slowly. "Closer than you imagine." A murmur ran through the room. Madame Armande sank deeper into the armchair, as if her body already knew the rest. Lucien leaned forward. Mathilde squeezed the wrist of his left arm, an old habit that revealed anxiety. Poirot turned towards the door. "You can come in now." The door opened, and for a moment the figure silhouetted against the light in the hallway seemed like an apparition. A thin man with a short beard and grey hair, holding a hat and a worn coat hanging like a shadow. His eyes were Etienne's, but more serene. His posture was that of someone who no longer expects anything. Delphine took a step back, unable to contain her exclamation. "My God!" Madame Armande closed her eyes. Lucien didn't know whether to sit down or run away. The man took 2 steps toward the centre of the room. "I didn't come to destroy what's left. I came to watch it crumble on its own." Poirot introduced him in a low voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, Alphonse Lemoine." The silence was total. Only the crackling of one of the lamps could be heard. "For years I was the echo of this house," Alphonse said softly. "I lived on the margins, watching from afar. Etienne stole what was mine. You allowed it, and yet I didn't come back for the money. I came back because he wrote to me." "Him?" Delphine interrupted, still stunned. "Yes." Alphonse nodded. 2 months ago, Etienne sent me a letter. He apologized. He said he wanted to make amends. That he couldn't bear the silence any longer. He gave me directions. He said, "Come when night falls. Go through the booth. No one should see you yet." Poirot added, "Etienne feared he wouldn't be able to uphold his decision in front of others. He knew there would be opposition, especially from his inner circle. He wanted to handle the truth privately before revealing it. But he didn't do it," Mathilde murmured. "No," Poirot replied, "because someone acted first. Someone who knew Alphonse was here. Someone who had more to lose than Etienne. And that person poisoned his brother before the truth came out." Everyone's eyes turned to Madame Armande. She didn't deny it. She just spoke with icy calm. "My husband was always Etienne's shadow. He obeyed him in everything. And yet he never inherited anything. When Etienne confessed to me that he was thinking of returning the lands of Arles to his lost brother, I knew the end of our era had arrived." Delphine intervened, hurt. "You killed a man out of pride." "No, child," Armande corrected her in a fragile voice. "I killed a man out of fear, because I didn't know how to live in a world where lies no longer protected me." Alphonse took a step forward. "I don't hate her, but her crime won't erase what Etienne tried to repair. He introduced me to Poirot. He left documents, confessions. I don't need justice. I just wanted someone to know." Poirot nodded. "And now everyone knows." Lucien, still pale, raised his voice. "Are you staying in the village?" Alphonse looked at him with a barely perceptible smile. "No. This place belongs to those who still believe they can change it. I don't belong anywhere anymore." He turned to Poirot. "Thank you for not rushing, for listening beyond the words." Poirot inclined his head. "I just follow where the little grey cells lead me, monsieur, and they're not wrong when the heart listens to them." That night, Alphonse left the villa as he had arrived. Quietly, Madame Armande was taken into custody with the imperturbable dignity of someone who no longer fears anything. And Poirot, from his room, wrote a final line in his notebook. "Some truths don't seek justice. They just seek to be seen before they disappear." The book was already closed, but its place on the shelf had changed forever. Chapter 11. The Traces of Forgiveness. The following days at Villa Lemoine passed with an almost artificial stillness, as if the house itself were trying to absorb the echoes of the crime and erase them from its walls. The library remained closed, and the north wing, where Alphonse had lived in secret, was sealed off by police order. The portraits, once so haughty, now seemed more sombre. No one looked at them with pride any more, only with thoughtful silence. Poirot, however, remained. Even though the case was solved, something still kept him at the property. It wasn't duty. It was a faint but persistent feeling that the story wasn't quite over, and the little grey cells wouldn't rest as long as something remained unfinished. One afternoon, while walking alone in the garden, he found Delphine sitting under the ancient linden tree with a closed book on her knees. "Monsieur Poirot," he said as he saw him approaching, "do you know what worries me?" "Mademoiselle, I have a list of possibilities. But why don't you tell me yourself?" Delphine didn't smile. "Everyone says we're at peace now, that justice has been done, that the past has been righted. But nothing has really changed. Lucien is still obsessed with his inheritance. Mathilde can't sleep. The police will come for more statements. The house hasn't breathed a sigh of relief." Poirot sat down delicately on the stone bench opposite her. "Peace, mademoiselle, is not a door that opens suddenly. It's a window that opens very slowly. And you? Do you think Alphonse was sincere?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. His voice wasn't that of a man who desired revenge. It was that of someone who had learned to live with loss, and who no longer sought punishment, but a way to close the circle. Etienne wanted reconciliation before he died. Alphonse allowed it. Delphine looked down. "I admired him, you know, for years. Etienne, for his elegance, his authority. Now I understand. It was fear, that attitude only covered the void of what he never wanted to acknowledge." "That's often how it is with powerful men," Poirot murmured. "The more rigid their control, the more fragile what they are trying to protect." At that moment, Mathilde appeared from the path leading to the greenhouse. Seeing them, she hesitated for a moment, then approached with short steps. "Shall I interrupt?" "Never, mademoiselle," replied Poirot. Mathilde sat next to Delphine and was silent for a few seconds before speaking. "I remembered something," he said, his voice faint. "The night before Etienne died, I heard music, very soft, like an old song. It came from the library. Alphonse played the piano, didn't he?" Delphine nodded slowly. "Yes, I did as a child." Mathilde turned to Poirot. "I didn't imagine it, did I?" Poirot looked at her gently. "No, mademoiselle, you didn't imagine it. It was a goodbye, a silent gesture between two brothers. One who wanted to ask for forgiveness, and the other who was already offering it. Matilda closed her eyes for a moment. A light breeze rustled the linden leaves. The next day, Poirot received a letter. No return address, but in familiar handwriting. Alphonse's handwriting. Mr. Poirot, thank you for not rushing to judgment. Thank you for understanding that not all truth needs noise. I'm leaving France. This time by my own choice, but I don't do it by running away. I do it in peace. I've left letter with my testimony in the hands of the notary, in case it's needed in Madame Armand's trial. I'm not seeking retribution, just clarity. If you ever visit Arles, you'll find an abandoned estate there. It used to be mine, and soon it will be someone else's. But if you walk to the last hill to the south, you'll see a rusty iron chair. There, I sat as a child, dreaming of the impossible. This time, the impossible happened. Alphonse. Poirot carefully placed the letter in the false bottom of his briefcase. Later that morning, he walked briskly down to the lobby, where the taxi was already waiting. Before going up, he turned one last time towards Villa-le-Moine. Nothing moved. Not the wind, not the curtains. But for him, something had changed. Not in the walls, but in what those walls no longer concealed. A story had been closed, and instead now, there was room for forgiveness. Chapter 12. Epilogue in 3 times. A week after Hercule Poirot's departure, calm returned to Villa-le-Moine, but it was a different kind of calm. Not the kind of imposed silence, but the echo that lingers behind, a quietly spoken truth. Every corner of the house now seemed to bear the weight of what had been revealed, as if the portraits, the books, and the corridors understood that their story had changed direction. Justice took its course. Madame Armande was discreetly transferred to a detention centre in Bordeaux. There was no press coverage, no public outcry. Poirot, in his written statement, had suggested leniency due to the defendant's age and mental state. The judge, after also reading Alphonse's letter, delivered by the notary d'Arsac, opted for an alternative measure, house arrest in a guarded residence. Armande accepted the verdict without protest. Deep down, she knew that her real sentence came not from the courtroom, but from the mirror. Matilda became the villa's unexpected guardian of order. With Delphine as her silent accomplice, they oversaw the cleaning of the library, the restoration of the original will papers, and the return of Alphonse's personal belongings to a box that now occupied a discreet but visible place in the West Wing. "What shall we do with the book?" Matilda asked one morning, pointing the Poetics of Space still on the low table. Delphine looked at it carefully, as if she could still hear the faint creaking of fate in its pages. Nothing. Let it stay there, as a warning, or as a closure. They both agreed not to move it, for the first time in many years. The book had a place that didn't need to be changed. Lucien, for his part, left the villa without a clear farewell. He left quietly one morning, leaving his ambition and rage behind like a forgotten coat. It was d'Arsac who received a postcard from Berlin a few days later. It didn't say much, just 3 lines. "I'm composing a symphony for a man who died without music. Don't look for me." Delphine never spoke of him again. Poirot, back in his London apartment, sat down one afternoon at his desk to write in his casebook. He titled it, "The Case of the Book That No One Touched, But Was Moved Twice." His summary was brief, unusually thoughtful. A crime without visible violence, a murderer who didn't want to kill, a victim who had already died, of regret, and a brother who was not seeking justice, but reparation. I have rarely faced a case where everyone, including the culprit, seemed more like victims than executioners. And yet, the tiny grey cells should not be confused with the fog of the heart. Logic must prevail, but this time so did compassion. He closed the notebook with a soft sigh. Then he walked over to the window. Outside, the Thames shimmered in the spring sunshine. "Ah, my dear Hastings," she murmured with a wistful smile. "I wish you were there. You would have understood the value of a misplaced book long before anyone else." On the estate in Arles, where Alphonse had spent his childhood, the sun now fell on young wheat fields. A new owner, a young philosophy professor, had bought it without knowing anything about its history. One day, while exploring the southern hill, he found a rusty wrought-iron chair. He sat down on it, not knowing why. He closed his eyes. The wind seemed to be telling him something he couldn't understand. Perhaps, at one time, someone there had dreamed that things could return to their place. And somehow, silently, they had done it. Chapter 13. The Last Words of a House. Even though the crime had been solved and the house was beginning to silence its past, something still troubled Delphine. At night, as she walked through the empty hallways and listened to the creaking of the centuries-old wood, she had the feeling that the story wasn't completely over. It wasn't fear. It was intuition. The certainty that something, a small, marginal, almost forgotten piece, still needed to be put together. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing the family ledgers, he found a black, leather-bound notebook among the drawers of Etienne's desk. It had no title on the cover, nor any label. When he opened it, he discovered a series of notes written by his uncle, in handwriting shakier than he knew. They weren't diaries, nor confessions. They were thoughts, fragments, reflections without an addressee. Portraits don't watch us. They judge us. I've seen Alphonse in my dreams, always on the hill, always with a look I couldn't interpret. My name weighs more than I can bear. I have nowhere else to put it. A truth unspoken becomes a shared lie. Delphine read for an hour. Each page confirmed what she already suspected. Etienne had begun to crumble long before Alphonse returned, not because of his brother, but because of the weight of time. She had wanted to correct her story, but too late. On a sheet of paper, near the end, she found a line that shocked her. Delphine will be the only one to understand. She also hears what the objects don't say. The phrase was disturbingly accurate. Because yes, Delphine had always paid attention to the location of everything. She had noticed the book. She had felt the shift in the house's energy. And now she understood. Her uncle, even in his arrogance, had chosen her as a witness. That night, he went up to the attic where the family's old belongings were stored. Among trunks and faded portraits, he found a piece of furniture covered by a white sheet. Upon uncovering it, he recognized an old music box that had often played in his childhood. He picked it up with both hands and placed it on a small table. When he opened it, the mechanism creaked, and a familiar melody began to play. A melody I hadn't heard for 20 years. Delphine didn't cry, but she knew that music was Etienne's last word, not justification, not redemption, just the echo of a story that could now, at last, be kept without fear. In London, Poirot received a letter from Delphine. Very brief, grateful. It read, "Mr. Poirot, the book has not moved, but this time it was by choice. Thank you for seeing what others dare not look at." D.L. Poirot smiled as he read it. He walked over to his bookshelf and took out a folder marked with gold ink, Case 132. Red Book. He placed it next to others that were already closed. Then, as if responding to a distant music that only he could hear, he slightly straightened a crooked volume between two novels. "Ah!" he murmured with satisfaction. "That's perfect." And he closed the bookshelf, this time with a key. Chapter 14. Echoes That Persist. Summer arrived with unexpected gentleness at Villa Lemoine. The windows remained open during the evenings, and the chandeliers, which had been silent witnesses to the crime, now hung clean, free of dust and cobwebs. But still, something invisible lingered. Not fear, but the subtle reverberation of a story that, though closed, left ripples in the air, like the notes that linger after the last key of a piano. Delphine, now the new administrator of the Lemoine legacy, devoted her days to restoring the family archives. She had started with the papers in the south wing, old letters, inventories, contracts. Each document was like a lost piece of identity that, when read, released dust and memory alike. She worked with white gloves, as if by doing so she could protect herself from the past while understanding it. One morning he found a sealed envelope among a pile of unsorted letters. It had no stamp or date, but the name written on the front was unmistakable. For H.P. For Hercule Poirot. Delphine held it between her fingers for several minutes. She hesitated. Then she decided she must do what the letter asked. She slipped it into a new envelope, wrote the detective's London address, which she still had thanks to the note Poirot had left her upon his departure, and sent it by international courier. In London, Poirot received the envelope with surprise. The paper was thick, French, and the seal looked like it had been pressed with an onyx ring. He opened it with his penknife, with the same care he applied to anything he didn't yet understand. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in a handwriting he knew, Etienne Lemoine. "Mr. Poirot, if this letter reaches you, it's because I didn't manage to finish what I set out to do. I don't trust courts, notaries, or even forgiveness. But I do trust logic, precision. The book moved because it had to. Not by mistake, but by strategy. You'll understand, I don't want you to justify me. But I want you to understand one thing. My crime wasn't against Alphonse. It was against time. I stole his chance to be part of the present. And that, monsieur, weighs more heavily on me than the gold I hid or the lands I usurped. When this is all over, I ask you a favour. Don't let this house become a museum or a fairy tale mansion. Make them understand that it was real, that the pain was real, that forgiveness was a gesture, not a reward. Only you can achieve it, Etienne. Poirot closed the letter slowly. He didn't move for several minutes. Then he stood up, crossed his study, and switched on his reading lamp. He took the file from the shelf. Case 132, Red Book, opened it and placed the letter inside between the last page of the police report and his own closing note. Then he took a new piece of paper and wrote in his personal notebook. Etienne Lemoine did not die redeemed, but yes, conscious, and in the world of crime, that is rarer than justice. Back at the villa, Delphine decided to open the gates to the people once a month. Not as an attraction, not out of curiosity, but as a symbolic act. Visitors could enter the library, see Etienne's desk, observe the Red Book, still in its place. No one touched it. One morning, a brown-haired girl approached the shelf and pointed at it. "Why is that book crooked?" Delphine smiled from the threshold. Because it was the first thing he told the truth. The girl didn't understand, but she nodded, satisfied. Then she ran into the garden. Delphine stood there for a moment longer, staring at the bookshelf. In the reflection of the glass, for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure from behind. A thin man, wearing a dark hat, walking toward the door. But when I turned around, there was no one there. Only the echo of a story that, although closed, he kept breathing among the books. Chapter 15. The Unwritten Page. The visits to Villa Lemoine continued month after month, discreet and respectful. It was not a place for ordinary tourists. Those who came usually did so in silence, crossing the threshold as one might a forgotten temple. The story of the crime had spread little by little, not in sensationalist newspapers, but in academic, literary, and even philosophical circles. Some spoke of the case as an essay on time, others as a family tragedy. Some called it simply the mystery of the motionless book. Delphine, without intending to, had become his guardian. She had restored just enough: the tapestry by the fireplace, the varnish on the bookcase, the white linen curtains. But she left many things as they were: the ink stain on Etienne's desk, the mark from Poirot's cane on the library threshold, and of course the poetics of space instead. One September afternoon, as the garden gilded in the slanting autumn light, a young art history professor asked to see Etienne's private archive. It wasn't something Delphine usually showed, but the visitor spoke with a mixture of humility and obsession that struck a chord with her. "I've read everything I can find on the case," he confessed as they walked down the East Wing hallway. "But there's something I don't understand. According to the records, Etienne left a final statement, one that wasn't included in the court summary. Is that true?" Delphine hesitated. She looked at him closely. The professor was young, no more than 30, with round glasses and hands that always seemed about to write something important. "Yes," he said finally. "There is one more statement, but it wasn't addressed to the police or to Poirot. It was for me." He led him to a small private room, formerly used as the Patriarch's archive. There, in an oak box, he kept Etienne's black notebook, which he had found weeks earlier. "Is it written in full?" the professor asked with restrained interest. "No," Delphine replied. "The last page is blank. It only has one sentence in the bottom margin." He showed him the sheet of paper. The professor read it in a low voice. "Only she can write what follows." The young man looked up. "Do you think he was talking about you?" Delphine nodded slowly. "I don't think so. I know. That evening, Delphine re-entered the library. No one was with her. No one knew she was there. She closed the door and lit only one lamp, the one Poirot had used during his interviews." He sat down at his desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper. He placed the open notebook next to it. He stared at the red book on the shelf, motionless. And he began to write. This is the story of a house that spoke without words. From a crime that was a seed, not a cut. Of a killer who didn't run away, and of a victim who was already tired. This is the story of those who chose to remember so that others could forget, and from a detective who not only found the culprit, but also what time tried to bury. He saved the page in the notebook, without signing it. Then he stood up and before leaving, allowed himself one last gesture. He walked over to the bookshelf, took The Poetics of Space with both hands, and this time he moved it. A centimetre, barely perceptible. But enough. Now it's done, he whispered. Now everything's in its place. He turned off the lamp, opened the door, and left without looking back. Outside, the September wind danced with the fallen leaves. Inside, the library breathed, as if he knew, too, that the story, at last, had been written in full. Chapter 16. The Invisible Hand. 2 months after that final gesture in the library, a letter with no return address was deposited in the Villa Lemoine mailbox. The envelope was made of old paper, slightly yellowed edges, and the handwriting bore only a single word. Delphine. She discovered it one morning while sorting through the correspondence on the hall table. The feel of the paper immediately reminded her of another letter. One Poirot had received months before, one that had changed the course of history. With steady hands, she went up to her study, closed the door, and reached for it. The letter said, "Mademoiselle." You moved the book, finally. That means he has understood something beyond the crime, beyond the guilt. He has understood the place of the gesture, the precision of silence. May I then have one more secret? It wasn't Etienne who placed the letter in the book, nor was it him who first moved the volume. It was me. I entered the house a week before Poirot arrived. Not to kill, not to take revenge, but to prove something. That the past still breathed. That objects, when allowed to speak, say more than witnesses. I left the note because I knew Etienne wouldn't. I wanted you to find it. I wanted you to listen to it first, because only you had the sensitivity to understand that a moving book is a language. I left that same night. I didn't learn of Etienne's death until days later. The news reached me at the Orange station. I didn't come back. I didn't have to, but I couldn't leave without telling you this. You didn't solve the crime. You solved the story. Delphine laid the letter on her desk. She didn't cry, but she didn't smile either. She was absorbed. What she had, felt from the beginning without understanding it, was now confirmed. There was another hand, an invisible presence. An author behind the movement that gave rise to it all. That night, she took out Etienne's black notebook, the same one she'd kept from the beginning, and placed Alphonse's letter inside, without adding a word. Then she walked barefoot to the library. She opened the doors slowly, letting the wood creak like a whisper. The book was still there, slightly shifted just as she had left it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned and headed to the least frequented corner of the room, a section dedicated to the family's historical correspondence. There, between diplomatic letters from great-grandfather Lemoyne and unfinished memoirs, he gently placed the notebook. It was his way of archiving history, not in shop windows, not in speeches, but in the same language that Alphonse used, the language of things that don't need to be explained, just placed in the right place. Days later, he received a call. It was the notary d'Arsac. "I received something curious," he said. "An anonymous package. Inside, an antique portrait. 4 people. One of them, according to my records, is Alphonse. But it's not a copy. It's the original, the one that disappeared from the house." "Where did they find him?" Delphine asked. "At Orange Station. Inside a wooden box with a note, 'I don't need to hide any more.'" Delphine hung up without adding anything else. Then he went out into the garden. He walked slowly to the cypress hedge that surrounded the back wall, where the gatehouse had once stood. There the grass had grown back. The stones, now covered with moss, had lost all visible memory. And yet she felt it. The story was still there, like a closed book, still breathing. He bent down and placed a small iron plaque among the bushes. It bore no names or dates, just an inscription. Here what was not said was heard. He covered it with dirt, stood up, and went home. As he crossed the gallery, he noticed that the evening light fell exactly on the shelf where the book lay. For the first time, he saw it glow with a different hue. Not a warning, but of peace. And then he knew there was nothing left to write. Just read. Chapter 17. The Silent Legacy. Winter was approaching at Villa Lemoyne, and with it a deeper, more permanent calm. Visits began to become more frequent, and Delphine did nothing to encourage them. She knew that the essential thing had already happened. The living story of the house had been shared with those who needed to hear it. The rest, the curious, the tourists, the journalists, were no longer necessary. In the library, the red book remained exactly where it was. No more tilted, no more upright. Some mornings, Delphine would sit in front of it, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, staring at the bookshelf with no intention of reading. Not out of sadness, out of respect, because she had understood that some stories don't open, but rather allow themselves to be closed. One dull morning, while sorting through a box of family letters, he found one in particular he'd forgotten. It was addressed to his mother, dated almost 30 years ago. The sender, Alphonse. It was brief, written in Old French and almost poetic. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was recognizable. She signed it without a surname, just with an initial A. A. I don't regret having left, but I do regret what I left unsaid. Time neither absolves nor condemns. It only accumulates if one day this house remembers my name, that he does not do it with guilt, but with the gaze of someone who sees the whole tree. not just the broken branch. Delphine kept the letter in her personal desk, not in the household archives. She understood then that not everything should be part of the official record. Some things, the most important ones, belonged to the private sphere, to the memory that is shared not with the world, but with oneself. Days later, an unexpected invitation arrived. The Musée des Archives Contemporaines in Avignon requested permission to include a reconstruction of the Lemoine case in a special exhibition. They wished to display objects, documents, and testimonies related to the crime that occurred without blood, but not without wounds. They had heard about the case through an academic article written by a young art history professor, the same one who had visited Villa Lemoine weeks earlier. Delphine didn't respond immediately. She paced around the house for 2 days, meditating. Finally, she wrote a short letter to the museum. The story has already been told, but it cannot be reproduced, because it is not a museum piece. It is a place where memory still breathes. Thank you for your interest, but the essential cannot be transferred. It can only be lived in silence. One windy night, Delphine woke with a start to a distant noise. It wasn't a knock, not a scream. It was something fainter, like a rustling, as if a page had been turned at random. She descended the main staircase, wrapped in a woolen dressing gown. The house was dim, but not entirely dark. In the library, a lamp had turned on by itself, the reading lamp next to Poirot's armchair. And on the table there was a new sheet of paper, blank, perfectly folded, no letters. Delphine took it, looked around, and then at the bookshelf. The red book had not moved, but there was a difference. Now, right next to it, between Montaigne and Baudelaire, lay a small black notebook. It had a handwritten label on it. Continue, for her. Continue, for her. Delphine opened it. There was only 1 page written on it, in fresh ink. Everything I experienced was not to explain a crime. It was to build a legacy, and legacy is not what is remembered. This is what is decided to continue. And Delphine closed the notebook. She put it back on the shelf. She said nothing. He just turned off the lamp, and in the darkness the house seemed to breathe with her. The story did not ask to be told again. She asked not to be forgotten. Chapter 18. The Unspoken Truth. Winter had covered the fields of Villa Lemoine with a fine layer of frost. The bare branches of the trees bent under the invisible weight of the cold, as if the house and its gardens were bowing in an act of farewell. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a full silence, complete. The kind of silence that remains after a truth is revealed and understood. Delphine woke up early that morning. A blue mist enveloped the windows, and for the first time in weeks, she lit the fire in the library before dawn. She prepared a tray of tea, sat down at Etienne's desk, and opened the black notebook that held the final pages of the mystery, not to read it again, but to finish it. Because if she'd learned anything from Poirot, it was that mysteries weren't solved by logic alone. They were closed with intention. And if that notebook was to be the definitive record of what happened at Villa Lemoine, it had to end with an honest conclusion, one that didn't belong to Poirot, or Alphonse, or even Etienne, but to her. He took up his pen. He took a deep breath. And he wrote, I have understood that houses do not keep the past, they just contain it until someone is ready to open it. He closed the notebook. But just at that moment, as if the universe refused to allow a complete closure, there was a soft knock at the front door. It was strange. No one had knocked unannounced for months. Delphine cautiously stood up, went down the hall, and opened it. An older man with a neatly trimmed beard and a silver-handled cane smiled under his grey hat. "Mademoiselle Delphine Lemoine," he said with a carefully measured accent, "I beg your pardon for this unannounced visit. My name is Jacques Delmotte. Perhaps you've heard of me." Delphine frowned. "Ought?" The man nodded respectfully. "Not directly, but I'm the notary who managed the Arles estate 40 years ago. Alphonse Lemoine contacted me briefly before he disappeared. I knew he wasn't dead, though I never knew where he was hiding. Until now, Delphine invited him in. She led him to the library. The fire was still lit. The red book was still in its place. What do you want, Monsieur Delmotte? I came to deliver this to you." He handed her a sealed envelope. The name written in blue ink was his own, Delphine Lemoine. Delphine opened the envelope leisurely. Inside, she found a legal document and a letter. The document was a recent will, dated in Lyon, months after the case was resolved. The signatory, Alphonse Lemoine. The letter said, "I don't want to leave any property, only will. I have donated the Arles estate to the Ministry of Culture to convert it into a haven for thought. But the heart of this story, the library, the documents, the gestures, belongs to you, not for me to keep, for you to use. Villa Lemoine must continue to breathe. And you, Delphine, are no longer his heir. She is the author." Delphine folded the letter carefully, without any visible emotion. Then she placed it next to the black notebook. "And you, Monsieur Delmotte?" he asked politely. "Why come in person?" The old man smiled. "Because your story has reached far and wide, and some believe it's not over yet. They asked me if it was real, if someone had really discovered the truth without proof, just with a book that moved." Delphine held his gaze. And what did he answer? That there are mysteries that cannot be solved with evidence, only with sensitivity, and that the greatest act of justice is not to discover the truth. It's knowing when to let it rest. The man said goodbye. He never reappeared. Weeks later, Poirot received a letter, written with a blue quill pen in firm ink. "Mr. Poirot, I'm writing to you not to report a crime, nor to solve a mystery, but to share the end of a story you helped begin." The library is still standing. The red book hasn't moved, but where there was once only death, there is now breath. I receive students, poets, and philosophers. No one asks about the crime. Everyone sits in silence and listens to the language of the house. I haven't changed anything. I have only learned to guard the invisible. Thank you for seeing what no one else saw. D.L. Poirot, having finished reading it, stood up, walked to his library, and placed the letter next to the file labelled case 1 to 32, red book. Then, with a slight gesture, he moved a small tome, barely a centimetre out of its place. And he smiled.